The Galactic Hegemony had been around for 11,000 years. 11,000 years. Let that sink in for a moment, because the hegemony certainly did constantly, loudly, and at every diplomatic gathering where free food was involved. They had absorbed 412 civilizations into their grand collective. They had mapped 93% of the known galaxy. They had a bureaucratic filing system so sophisticated that a single trade dispute could generate enough paperwork to deforest an entire moon. They were, by every measurable standard, the most powerful political entity in the history of organized intelligent life. And then they met humans. Now, I want to be clear. I, Vrethkai of the observational caste, third lens of the Scifi Compact, was not present for the first contact. I was, thankfully, recording my field notes on a perfectly pleasant water world, 3 systems away, when the hegemony's Grand Ambassador Thesaurel Vane decided, in his infinite wisdom, to approach the human homeworld with a fleet of 40 warships. For diplomatic purposes, he said. To demonstrate cultural respect, he said. To establish the natural order of things, he said. What he actually did was park 40 heavily armed vessels in orbit around a planet populated by 8 billion creatures who had, and I cannot stress this enough, invented the concept of competitive eating as a spectator sport. These were not beings who responded well to implied threats. These were beings who looked at an ocean full of things trying to kill them and said, "I wonder what that tastes like." The warning came 3 hours after the hegemony fleet established orbit. Not a fleet response. Not a military scramble. One transmission, from one human, representing what their records called the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. Her name was Petra Oduya, and she had the kind of voice that sounded pleasant right up until the moment you realized what she was actually saying. "Greetings, Ambassador Vane," she said, in perfect hegemony standard, which, by the way, humans had been secretly learning for 6 years without telling anyone, because of course they had. "We appreciate the theatrical entrance. However, we want to be transparent with you. We have scanned your vessels. We understand your weapon systems. We've run approximately 4,000 combat simulations in the last 2 hours." A pause. You don't want to do whatever it is you're planning to do. This is your one warning. We hope you have a lovely rest of your day. The transmission ended. Ambassador Vane, a being who had successfully absorbed 19 civilizations into the hegemony fold through this exact method of intimidating orbital presence, laughed. His entire staff laughed. The fleet captains laughed. It was, by all accounts, a very jovial atmosphere aboard the command ship Eternal Dominion, right up until Admiral Sura Balindra, his chief tactical officer, stopped laughing approximately 4 seconds before everyone else. "Ambassador," she said quietly, pulling up her sensor readings, "their weapons just came online. Not some of their weapons. Not a defensive array. Every tracked human military installation on the surface, in the orbital stations, and this was the part that made Sura Balindra's secondary heart actually skip, on the 17 vessels that had materialized from behind their moon without anyone detecting their approach, all simultaneously powered up targeting systems." Vane was still chuckling when Sura grabbed his arm. "Sir, they had ships behind the moon." "Well, of course we didn't see them at all, until they wanted us to." The laughing stopped. Now, here is where the hegemony made its fatal mistake. Not a military mistake, not yet, a philosophical one, because Thesaurel Vane looked at those 17 vessels, looked at his 40 warships, did the math, decided the math was in his favor, and concluded that the warning had been a bluff. He had never dealt with humans before. He did not understand that humans do not bluff about things they consider non-negotiable. He did not understand that Petra Oduya had chosen her words with the specific, deliberate precision of someone who had already decided what would happen next and was simply giving him the opportunity to make a different choice. He did not take the opportunity. "Open a channel," Vane said, straightening his ceremonial robes. "Tell them the hegemony appreciates their passion, and that we look forward to welcoming them into the collective fold." Sura Balindra filed a formal objection, which was standard hegemony procedure, which meant it would be reviewed in approximately 40 years by a subcommittee. Petra Oduya received the ambassador's response, read it twice, exhaled slowly through her nose, and turned to the man sitting to her left. Lieutenant Commander Haruto Mwangi, head of the First Contact Tactical Division, was already pulling up his operational board, They didn't listen, she said. No, he agreed. Okay. She straightened her jacket. Execute Protocol 17. Now, I have since obtained the full tactical logs of what happened next, and I have reviewed them 14 times, and every single time I get to the same sequence of events, I have to take a moment and sit very quietly and think about my life choices. Because, and I say this as a trained xenosociological observer with 40 years of field experience, I was not prepared. Protocol 17 did not involve the human warships firing. That would have been straightforward. That would have been understandable. What Protocol 17 involved was the following. Every human warship simultaneously broadcast a navigational hazard warning on all hegemony frequencies, flagging the entire orbital zone as a restricted area. Standard hegemony law, which humans had apparently read in its entirety, required all hegemony vessels to respond to navigational hazard warnings by conducting a full system diagnostic, a process that took between 8 and 12 minutes and, critically, during which no offensive weapon systems could be actively maintained. The humans had used hegemony law to briefly disable 40 warships. While the fleet was running its mandatory diagnostics, 6 human vessels moved to positions that, according to every tactical analyst who has since reviewed the logs, perfectly covered every possible exit vector from the orbital zone. Not threateningly, not with weapons hot, they just parked there, calmly. The way you might stand in a doorway when you want someone to understand that leaving is technically still an option, but you'd like to finish the conversation first. When the hegemony fleet completed its diagnostics and its weapons came back online, they found themselves in a very different situation than they'd been in 12 minutes earlier. Sura Balindra ran 3 tactical assessments in the time it took Vane to realize what had happened. All 3 reached the same conclusion. She handed him the results without a word. He read them for a long time. They haven't fired, he said finally. No, sir. They could have. During the diagnostic window. Yes, sir, but they didn't. No, sir. They just repositioned. Vane looked at the sensor display. At the 6 human ships. At the 17 that had come from behind the moon. At the very calm, very patient icon on his communications board, indicating that the human diplomat was waiting for him to respond to her channel request, which she had submitted. He checked the timestamp. 9 minutes ago during the diagnostic window, while she absolutely could have been doing other things. He accepted the channel. Petra Oduya's face appeared on his screen. She looked, he would later describe in his official report, like someone who had already won an argument and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Ambassador Vane, she said pleasantly. I believe we were discussing a warning. Vane was a diplomat. He had been doing this for 60 years. He had the kind of professional composure that could survive a supernova press conference. And he deployed all of it now, as he said, with remarkable steadiness. Miss Oduya, perhaps we should revisit the parameters of this discussion. I'd like that very much, she said. What followed was 11 hours of negotiation, which I am told was, by human standards, relatively brief. By the end of it, Ambassador Vane had agreed to withdraw the fleet to a neutral distance, acknowledge Earth's sovereignty under a provisional framework pending full review, and this one still gets me, issue a formal apology for what Petra Oduya's team had carefully, legally and correctly classified under hegemony statute as an unauthorized navigational incursion into a protected biosphere zone, a filing that had been submitted to the hegemony's own legal registry 4 hours before the fleet arrived, using credentials obtained from a public hegemony database, processed by an automated system that had no idea it was essentially issuing humans a legal weapon they would use the same week. The hegemony fleet departed. Back on Hegemony Prime, the Council of 30 received Vane's report, reviewed the legal filings, watched the tactical recordings, and convened an emergency session. Grand Councillor Mevan Prath, oldest member of the council, survivor of 6 political upheavals, being who had personally overseen the absorption of 11 civilizations, sat at the head of the table and said nothing for a very long time. They used our own law, said Councillor Dreva Osun, who handled military affairs and was looking at the tactical logs with the expression of someone who had bitten into fruit and found it was a completely different fruit than expected. They filed the paperwork before our fleet arrived, said Councillor Wim Talik, who handled legal affairs and was having a significantly worse day than Dreva. They had ships behind the moon, said Sura Balindra, who had been summoned to give testimony and was the only person in the room who seemed to have fully processed the situation. Ships we could not detect until they chose to be detected. Prath finally spoke. How long, he said slowly, have humans had stealth technology at that level? Belindra checked her notes. Our best estimate, based on hull configuration and drive signature analysis, is approximately 8 years. And in 8 years, they told no one. No, Grand Counselor. They didn't sell it, didn't demonstrate it, didn't use it in any of the 17 minor border conflicts they've been involved in during that period. No. Prath leaned back in his seat. They were saving it. The room was very quiet. For what? Dreva asked. Belindra looked at her notes again, as though hoping they had changed since the last time she'd read them. They had not. Grand Counselor, in reviewing human strategic literature, which is extensive and deeply unsettling, there's a concept they call deterrence. The idea is that the most powerful weapon is one you never have to use, because your opponent knows you have it. Prath absorbed this. So, Wim Talek said carefully, the ships behind the moon were not their secret. No, Belindra confirmed. Based on our analysis, we believe the ships behind the moon were what they were comfortable letting us see. Another silence. Longer this time. Mevan Prath, Grand Counselor of the Hegemony, a being who had looked at 11 civilizations and seen either future members or future lessons, looked around the table and said 4 words that were later classified as the official beginning of the hegemony's most significant strategic policy reassessment in 400 years. What else do they have? Nobody answered, because nobody knew, and that was, as I have reflected upon many times in my ongoing field research, entirely the point. The hegemony's intelligence apparatus was, by galactic consensus, the finest ever assembled. They had operatives embedded in 41 civilizations. They had listening arrays that could detect a whispered conversation across 3 star systems. They had analytical engines that could predict political upheaval on a world they'd never visited, based purely on agricultural export patterns. They were very, very good at knowing things. They spent the next 14 months trying to find out what else humanity had, and at the end of those 14 months, the head of hegemony intelligence, a meticulous, unflappable being named Corvus Theld, who had never once in 30 years of service submitted an incomplete report, walked into Grand Counselor Prath's office, sat down and said, "We don't know." Prath looked up from his desk. "How much don't we know?" "Comprehensively," Corvus said. "Sir, we have intercepted 47,000 human communications in the last year. We have placed operatives in 6 human population centers. We have analyzed every public and semi-public military record available. We have built the most sophisticated threat assessment model our analytical division has ever constructed." He paused. "The model keeps returning an error." "What kind of error?" "The kind where it asks us to input more data, because what we've given it is statistically insufficient to generate a reliable threat estimate." Another pause. "We've never had that happen before." Prath set down his stylus. "What do your operatives say?" Corvus opened his briefing file, though from his expression, he clearly wished he hadn't. Operative Seni Vorak, stationed in a human city called Nairobi, reports that humans appear to be entirely unbothered by our increased intelligence activity, and that on 3 separate occasions, humans who were almost certainly aware of her surveillance smiled at her and offered her food. Something called mandazi. She says it was excellent. "She is compromised, sir. We're pulling her out." Prath pinched the bridge of his primary sensory ridge, and the others. Operative Bale Drew infiltrated a human research installation and spent 6 weeks cataloging what he believed to be a weapons development program. He filed his final report last week. Corvus turned a page. It was a facility for studying migratory patterns of a small winged creature they find aesthetically pleasing. A weapons program. "Birds, sir." It was birds. There was a long and deeply dignified silence. Operative Mira Luce, Corvus continued, because the day had to get worse somehow, attempted to access a human military database and successfully penetrated 17 layers of security before discovering that all the truly sensitive information was stored on a system that was not connected to any external network whatsoever. Not encrypted, not firewalled, simply not connected. She spent 4 days in the system before realizing she had accessed their archive of historical sports statistics. Prath stared at him. They are meticulous about those statistics, Corvus added, with the tone of someone reporting a thing that is true whether or not it is helpful. Extraordinarily meticulous. Prath stood, walked to his window, and looked out at the gleaming towers of Hegemony Prime, at the civilization he had helped steward, the empire that had absorbed 412 others, that had never in 11,000 years met something it couldn't model, predict, or outmaneuver, and said, very quietly, "Send a diplomatic team." Corvus blinked. "Sir, not a fleet, not operatives, a team, actual diplomats. People who will sit across a table from human diplomats and have a real conversation. That is." Corvus searched for the word. "Unprecedented." "So are they," Prath said. The diplomatic team that arrived at Earth's orbital station 3 weeks later was led by a hegemony envoy named Delara Sin, who had been chosen specifically because she was brilliant, adaptable, and this was the part Prath had emphasized personally, capable of being surprised without panicking. She was accompanied by 4 aides, 2 cultural analysts, and Sura Balindra, who had asked to come because she had not stopped thinking about the ships behind the moon for 14 months and felt she deserved answers. They were met at the docking port by Haruto Mwangi, who had apparently been reassigned from tactical operations to something called the Office of First Contact Relations, and a woman named Petra Oduya, who was apparently just always there whenever something important was happening with the hegemony, because humans apparently had a sense of narrative consistency that bordered on theatrical. Petra shook Delara's hand, a human greeting ritual involving the clasping of upper appendages that was documented but somehow still mildly startling in person, and smiled with the warmth of someone who had absolutely run 4,000 simulations on this meeting too, and said, "Welcome to Earth Station 1. We've been looking forward to this, as have we," Delara said, because she was a professional. What followed was 3 days of formal discussions, meals, cultural exchanges, and one incident that Sura Balindra later described in her personal log as the moment she understood humans completely, and also not at all. On the second evening, their human hosts took the delegation to observe something called a training exercise, which Sura had requested specifically because she wanted to see human military capability firsthand. She expected a demonstration, a show of force, something calibrated to impress. What she got was a group of 12 humans running an obstacle course in the rain, arguing cheerfully with each other about the optimal technique for scaling a particular wall, while an officer named Captain Yeva Sorakina stood nearby, with a timer, and the expression of someone who had learned to find this endearing through sheer exposure. When one of the soldiers made it over the wall in record time, the others made a noise, a collective sound of appreciation and mockery simultaneously, that Sura's translator rendered as a term of affection so profane, she made a note to review the translation matrix. "This is your military training," Sura said to Haruto, who was standing beside her. "Part of it," he confirmed. "They're arguing. They always argue. It helps." He considered this. "We've found that people who argue about the best way to do something tend to actually find the best way to do it, eventually." Sura watched Captain Sorakina say something to the group that made them all burst into laughter, despite being soaking wet and exhausted, and then watched them immediately line up and run the course again, faster. "How do you maintain discipline?" she asked, "if they are always laughing?" Haruto seemed to find this a genuinely interesting question. "How do you maintain effectiveness?" he responded, "if they aren't?" Sura did not have a good answer for that, and she was the kind of person who noticed when she didn't have good answers. The formal discussions, meanwhile, were going better than Delara had dared to hope, and stranger than she had expected. Humans negotiated the way they apparently did everything, with a simultaneous commitment to complete transparency and absolute strategic opacity. Petra would tell them, plainly and directly, exactly what humanity wanted from a relationship with the hegemony: recognition of sovereignty, equitable trade frameworks, technology exchange on mutually agreed terms, and no more fleets appearing in their orbital space unannounced. Then she would sit back and wait, and the waiting had a quality to it that Delara couldn't quite name until the third day, when she finally realized what it was. Petra Oduya was never worried. Not once. In 3 days of high-stakes diplomatic negotiation with the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, did she display a single moment of genuine anxiety. Delara had negotiated with civilizations, begging to join the hegemony for protection. She had negotiated with civilizations that were terrified of the hegemony's rejection. She had negotiated with civilizations that were angry or desperate or proud to the point of self-destruction. She had never negotiated with a civilization that appeared to simply be fine, whatever happened. On the evening of the third day, Delara asked her directly. They were sitting in a room overlooking what humans called an ocean, a quantity of water so vast that Delara, who came from a dry world, kept having a low-level physiological stress response to it, drinking something warm and slightly bitter that was apparently a cornerstone of human civilization, and Delara said, "Can I ask you something personal?" Petra said, "Sure. You're not afraid of us." It wasn't quite a question. Petra treated it like one anyway. Should we be? We've absorbed 412 civilizations. 413 attempted to resist, Petra said pleasantly. We read those histories very carefully. She looked at the ocean. We noticed a pattern. Delara waited. Every civilization that resisted the hegemony lost because they either panicked and struck first, or waited too long and lost the initiative. Petra wrapped both hands around her cup. So when your fleet showed up, we made sure we weren't panicking, and we made sure you understood, very clearly, very early, that we were not going to wait. And then we waited, because we didn't need to do anything else. You were confident in your position. We were confident that your ambassador would rather go home than start a war he wasn't certain of winning. She glanced at Delara with an expression that was friendly and precise in equal measure. We've found that most people, when you really look at it, would rather not start wars they're not certain of winning. And, if he had been certain, Petra smiled. He wasn't though, was he? Delara thought about Sura Balindra's tactical reports, about the ships behind the moon, about the intelligence division that had spent 14 months failing to find what it was looking for. She thought about Corvus Theld saying, "We don't know," which he had never said before, and thought about what it meant that humans had arranged things so that "we don't know" would be the hegemony's conclusion. "How long," she said, "did you spend preparing for first contact with a hostile power?" Petra's smile shifted slightly, into something quieter and a little harder to read. "How long have we known other civilizations exist?" Delara searched her records. "Your first confirmed interception of non-human communication was approximately 40 years ago," Petra confirmed. "We spent 40 years assuming that whoever showed up first might not be friendly. We planned accordingly." She tilted her head slightly. "You're the first ones who showed up. So," she shrugged, a gesture Delara had learned meant something between acceptance and deliberate understatement. "Here we are. 40 years. Humanity had spent 40 years preparing, quietly and completely, for the possibility that first contact would be with someone like the hegemony. And when the hegemony arrived with 40 warships and 600 years of institutional confidence, humanity had been ready, measured, precise, and utterly deliberately infuriatingly calm. The treaty was signed on the fourth day. Full sovereignty recognition, equitable trade terms, a mutual non-aggression framework, technology exchange committees, a clause, submitted by Petra Oduya, and accepted after only 20 minutes of deliberation by Delara Sin, specifying that any future hegemony vessels wishing to approach Earth's orbital zone would submit their itinerary 48 hours in advance through a designated diplomatic channel. The same way, the clause noted in language that was technically neutral and practically pointed that any civilized party might be expected to call ahead before showing up at someone's home. Sura Balindra signed as a witness. She spent the signing ceremony staring at a point on the wall and thinking, and after it was done she found Haruto Mwangi and asked the question she had been carrying for 14 months. "The ships behind the moon," she said. "Were those actually your best?" Haruto looked at her for a long moment. A very specific kind of moment. The kind where someone is deciding not how to answer, but how much of the answer to give. "They were the ships we were comfortable letting you see," he said, which was word for word what Sura had told the council, and which hit her now with the full weight of having been correct. "The ones we weren't comfortable showing you." He picked up his cup, took a sip, set it back down. "Well, hopefully we never have to be." Sura Balindra filed her final report on the mission 6 days later. It was, for a report from the chief tactical advisor of the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, remarkably short. It said that humanity represented a strategic variable that the hegemony's existing models were not designed to accommodate. It said that any future posture toward humanity should be cooperative rather than coercive, and not because humanity was necessarily more powerful than the hegemony. That remained an open and genuinely unanswerable question, but because humanity was the first civilization she had encountered in 30 years of military service that had demonstrated, clearly and repeatedly, that it had thought further ahead than she had. It said, in its final line, a thing that was subsequently classified and removed from the public record, but that Corvus Theld read and showed to Proth, and that Proth read twice before setting it on his desk and not saying anything for a while. They gave us one warning. They only needed one. I recommend we remember why. I, Vrethkai, of the observational cast, have now spent 3 years documenting humanity from a respectful distance that I have personally selected to be well outside their detection range, probably. I have filed 46 reports with the Scifi Compact. My most recent one contains my professional assessment of whether humanity poses a threat to civilizations who engage with them in good faith. It does not. Humans are, in my experience, generous, chaotic, occasionally baffling, deeply committed to feeding anyone who enters their vicinity, and possessed of a collaborative warmth that makes sustained diplomatic relationships genuinely pleasant. They are also, and I want this part of my report to be clearly understood by every Compact official who reads it, the only civilization I have ever studied that manages to be, simultaneously and without apparent contradiction, the most approachable species in the galaxy, and the last species you ever want to have decided you are its enemy. They gave the hegemony one warning. One was enough. The hegemony listened, eventually, which is more than most manage, and which is precisely why both of them are still here. I am going to go file my report now, from my perfectly safe, undetectable, extremely well-chosen observation point. Probably undetectable. I am going to go file my report.